The Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy and the American Educational Trust hosted a conference in Washington, D.C. on U.S. relations with Israel and the pro-Israel lobby. Panelists discussed the political influence of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and college campus debates about Israel. This part of the conference is 2 hours and 40 minutes.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started promptly at 9 o'clock here. Thanks for being here on time, despite the 40-mile-an-hour winds outside. We're glad that you were all here. Winds have changed, we hope. I'm Dale Sprzansky. I'm the assistant editor of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. And on behalf of the Washington Report and the Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy, we would like to welcome you all to today's conference. Once again, this annual conference is convening on the eve of the annual American Israel Public Affairs Committee Policy Conference, where a bipartisan group of congressmen and other officials will once again gather to reaffirm their unwavering support for the state of Israel. It is our hope that today's event provides some context and insight into how the lobby functions and why its influence is worth talking about. Today's event is also being held at a time when a national discussion is taking place about the role of special interest groups in the political process. In the aftermath of last month's shooting in Parkland, Florida, Americans have engaged in a relatively open and healthy discussion about the role of the National Rifle Association. And we believe that as the most powerful foreign lobby in the United States, the Israel lobby's actions must also be openly debated. And we hope that today's event will help facilitate such a discussion. So before we begin, just some information and ground rules for the day. We are expecting a pretty full room, so we ask that you do make sure all the seats are open and to not occupy them with bags or coats or anything like that. During the Q&A session, it will be done via note cards. There are note cards and pens in the bags you were given at registration. Please write down your question on the cards. Find an usher. They will be circulating throughout the presentations. And please don't hesitate to give them to the ushers during the discussion. The moderators like to be able to sort through the questions before the Q&A begins. We have an exhibition hall located next door. It will close at 4:30 this year, so please be sure to stop in during the breaks and visit our wonderful exhibitors. Our bookstore this year is located right behind you in the alcove. We have all sorts of books, pottery, olive oil, and whatnot available for sale there. Book signings will take place at registration, except for the book signings taking place after the program. They will take place here in the main ballroom. Also near registration, there is an exhibit where you can go to pick up tickets for the reception afterwards. That will give you one free alcoholic or non-alcoholic beverage of your choice during the reception. So please be sure to visit the booth to pick up your ticket. We ask, of course, that you don't record any videos unless you were given prior permission. Wi-Fi information is available in the back of your program. We encourage everyone to tweet at the hashtag IsraelLobbyCon, C-O-N. Today's event is also being broadcast live on C-SPAN 2, and we also encourage our online audience and TV audience to participate in the conversation. We also ask, of course, that you please refrain from talking and whatnot here in the ballroom and take your conversations outside into the exhibition hall. And of course, we wouldn't be here without our fantastic donors, so we have to give them our immense gratitude for funding today's event and making all of this possible. We're also happy to welcome numerous groups from around the country, students, as well as dignitaries from 12 embassies: Afghanistan, Algeria, the Arab League, Czech Republic, Egypt, Iraq, Kosovo, Morocco, Oman, the PLO, Russia, and Tajikistan. And of course, many of you know the Israel lobby is more than an international issue. It's more than a domestic issue. It's also an international issue. So we're sure they'll find our first panel on Israel and the UN to be of particular interest. With that, I would like to introduce Grant Smith of the Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy, again, a co-sponsor of this event. Grant and his organization are committed to uncovering and documenting how the Israel lobby works and operates through its research and its Freedom of Information Act requests. Grant is the author of several books on the lobby, his most recent being Big Israel, How Israel's Lobby Moves America. That book is available for sale at our bookstore and is also now available online as an audiobook. So with that, I'd like to welcome Grant to the stage. He will provide an overview of the lobby and of today's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale, and welcome everybody. As he said, I'm going to be reviewing the Israel Lobby's agenda in some detail, and it explains, I think, best why we've invited this particular group of experts to speak today, and I'll try to mention as many of them as I can as we review the stakes, the very high stakes and challenges that are being presented here in the United States and globally, which are higher than ever before. The Israel Lobby, in terms of a nonprofit sector snapshot, and this is coming out of the database that was compiled for my book, Big Israel, is an ecosystem of organizations that advance Israel at very many levels. And this is on track to be a $6.3 billion industry in 2020. Nearly 500 separate medium-sized to major organizations, with certainly AIPAC and the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League and many others at the top. But if you add it up, it's almost 17,000 employees, 500,000 volunteers, working in organizations that have the advancement of Israel as one of their primary objectives in the United States. Their designated voice, as Dale mentioned, leveraging the collective power of these grassroots integrated organizations, is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and it will, of course, be meeting in its annual policy conference this weekend. And so there will be a great deal of triumph in the achievement of one of its long-term objectives, which was realized in President Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now, the announcement was followed by a State Department announcement saying that the U.S. Embassy will be moved to Jerusalem in May. And it's something that, since its founding in 1948, Israel has wanted all countries to do, to give official recognition, locate their embassies in Jerusalem rather than Tel Aviv. But of course, the original 1947 partition plan of Palestine into Arab and Israeli states required that Jerusalem be internationalized. Both Palestinians and Israelis want Jerusalem to be their capital. So why is the US doing this? In the 1970s, the Zionist Organization of America began sending 100,000 signature petitions to the president asking him to withdraw from the UN agreements and also recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital and locate the US Embassy there. In the 1980s, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, the Christian Coalition, all said that we really ought to move the embassy, Mr. President. It'll be popular, particularly with American Christians and Jews. And AIPAC got serious about passing a highly coercive move the embassy law in the 1990s. They did it to thwart the Oslo peace process, which had its own problems, but by creating facts on the ground, the Zionist Organization of America and AIPAC hoped that they could preempt any moves from the Oslo peace accords, and they got their law, which had a presidential waiver provision to avoid constitutional separation of power issues. President Clinton allowed the Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995 to pass without signing it. And then for 2 decades, the Israel lobby pressed presidential candidates to promise to move the embassy as part of their campaign. And most of them, of course, did it. In the Democratic Party side, Joe Biden, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton. Republican side, George W. Bush, Ted Cruz, Bob Dole. But every winner of the office signed a waiver every 6 months not to move the embassy. And so the Jerusalem Embassy Act, again, required that the State Department not be allowed to use its overseas construction budget until this was done. But presidents waived it every 6 months until President Trump overturned all of that and recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and said that the US would move the embassy. Americans have never supported this. Upon the Trump administration's announcement, 36% of Americans polled by CNN said that they opposed recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. When polled, 57% of Americans in January of 2017 said that they were opposed to moving their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So the US is becoming Israel's designated arbiter of territorial claims, I would say, via the power of the Israel lobby. George W. Bush even signed a letter to Prime Minister Sharon saying that he didn't expect them to withdraw from certain territories if they didn't want to. So this has been something that's been a while in coming. But the question is, can the US really be considered to be a legitimate actor in making these territorial declarations and bestowing legitimacy because the lobby wants it? The embassy move and related measures, such as cutting US assistance to Palestinian refugees in the UN and others, are why we have a real panel of experts coming up to talk about the United Nations and other important issues. So, agenda number 2, the Israel lobby would very much like to pass a federal law mandating that criticism of Israel in some cases is equivalent to anti-Semitism. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act is an expansive US State Department definition of what anti-Semitism is, also crafted by Israel lobby organizations, which is designed to clamp down on criticism of Israel, particularly on college campuses. And so Israel lobby organizations backing such laws want to be able to say that certain criticism under this State Department definition is anti-Semitism and that federal funding should be withdrawn from higher education in certain cases if it's allowed to happen. When advised that major American civil liberty groups are opposed to this law, such as the ACLU, 61% of Americans also oppose this particular measure, cutting off foreign assistance to higher education. And to discuss this, we have Dr. Barry Trachtenberg, a Holocaust scholar and author of the new book, The United States and the Nazi Holocaust, who testified before the House Judiciary Committee on November 7 to discuss the real politics behind the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. And we'll also hear from the eminent scholar, Dr. Rabab Abdul-Hadi, who prevailed in a lawsuit filed against her, which some people believe, including me, that she might not have if this federal law had been in place. This is not the only Israel lobby gag law that's in place. There's a legislative rule with the force of law currently in effect through the Department of Energy that says any government contractor or employee cannot publicly say or write that Israel has a nuclear weapons program, under penalty of losing their job, their security clearances, and being treated like a criminal. And if you don't believe that, simply ask former National Laboratory employee James Doyle. That de facto law is called WPN 136, and it's had a devastating impact on legitimate discussions of nuclear proliferation in this country and many countries in the world don't consider the US to be particularly forthcoming as a non-proliferation partner. An expanded topic for this year's conference is the role of Christian evangelicals as a force multiplier of the Israel lobby at the ballot box. The Israel lobby's stewardship of this group has been underway for a very, very long time. AIPAC has been courting such groups since the late 1950s and early 1960s, when AIPAC was still just a little unincorporated committee inside a larger body called the American Zionist Council. And this is some of their secret internal communications and outreach plans from the 1960s, when its parent was under investigation and ultimately ordered to register as an Israeli foreign agent. It's about cultivating religious leaders, generating positive press, and counteracting opposition. There's a reason for all of this. Why are Christian evangelicals so important, more important than ever today, to the Israel lobby? Well, it's because most Americans aren't avid members of the Zionist movement. If you ask them in the most anodyne of terms, and nobody ever has until July of last year, a Zionist is a person who believes in the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. Most Americans, 70.3%, don't consider themselves to be Zionists. However, the biggest challenge to the lobby is to maintain the illusion that there's broad grassroots support across the United States for Israel, and therefore that the policies that AIPAC pushes are broadly popular. But today there's a major partisan split. In this Pew Research survey of American adults, January 10 and 15 of this year, we can see that sympathy among Democrats for Israel and independence has tanked at 27% and 42% sympathy, respectively. A comprehensive Pew Research poll published in October of 2013 also indicated that 38% of American Jews, many who are Democrats, don't believe the Israeli government is serious about a peaceful resolution to the conflict, and that only 17% agreed that the settlements were conducive to Israel's security. And according to a recent Brand Israel study group, support for Israel, quote, support for Israel among Jewish college students in the United States has dropped 32% between 2010 and 2016. Among Republicans, there's near unconditional sympathy for Israel. It's never been higher, in fact. 79%, according to the January Pew Research polling. So the Christian evangelical wing, which is highly supportive of Israel and overwhelmingly voted for Trump, has become absolutely vital to the lobby. And within the Israel lobby ecosystem, it's become a player. Christians United for Israel, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, are financially inconsequential if you add it up compared to the mainline Israel lobby support organizations, but their votes are not inconsequential. Again, according to Pew, we've got 80 million Christian evangelicals, and 95% of them say that Israel is a primary or important factor in selecting their presidential candidate. Americans, despite the wide partisan split, if you look at the last platform planks on Israel in the Republican and the Democratic Party, Americans who are no longer supportive of Israel, would like a less Israel-centric policy, have nowhere to go. The U.S. approach to the Middle East in terms of the Republican and Democratic Party platforms in 2016 were nearly identical. The Republican planks, a little bit more strident, but they're basically asserting shared values, no daylight in policy making between the two governments, and essentially no choice for voters. So turning Israel into a topic that's beyond all rational debate and preempting other considerations in such large religious organizations is something that's extremely important. For that reason, we've invited Thomas Getman, former head of World Vision, to explain exactly how this came to be. The Israel lobby expends a significant amount of resources pressuring the media and trying to shape the narrative. And there are specialty organizations, such as the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Facts and Logic about Middle East and the Israel Project, that do nothing else, such as watching who comments on C-SPAN every morning and then making a big deal out of it if it's not particularly happy about U.S. Middle East policy. Last year, some of you may remember, Al Jazeera undertook a major undercover investigation of the lobby and how it really operates in the United Kingdom. But they also had an undercover investigation of what was going on in the United States. This report, called The Lobby, presented a threat. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee and other groups were determined that Americans not be allowed to see the U.S. version. Their threats included getting the U.S. government to deny landing rights to Qatar Airways, a $10.6 billion organization with 43,000 employees. Their threats included having the Justice Department register Al Jazeera's reporters as foreign agents, which would cut off their access to U.S. government officials and limit their access to government facilities. And this pressure campaign has worked. You will not be able to see the U.S. version of The Lobby, which should have aired before the AIPAC meeting this year, air. But we're happy to have two journalists who have withstood this kind of pressure, Ali Abuniba of the Electronic Intifada and Gideon Levy of Haaretz. And just as fierce as the battle to legally equate criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism is the drive to outlaw economic boycotts and other First Amendment activities targeting Israel to pressure it into better human rights comportment. It's the subject of most major Israel advocacy direct mail fundraising campaigns these days. Crush BDS. BDS is anti-Semitic and should be made illegal, say these mailings. And although there have been some victories against some of these laws, one in Kansas by the ACLU defending a contractor who wouldn't sign a waiver saying that she would never boycott Israel in return for her contract with the Kansas State Education Department. The fight is far from over. And so, if you look at what's behind the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, you see that its key backer, Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, among his donors, top 2017 donors, 86% of the individual contributors administer, run, or belong to Israel affinity organizations, including Howard Friedman of AIPAC. Among his top non-Democratic Party PACs, many of them stealth PACs, which have misleading names, but really only invest in Israel's lobbying agenda and AIPAC's lobbying agenda, provided 31% of his campaign contributions in the top 20. And if we continue down the line, we see that members of Israel lobby organizations, looking at his donor lineup, rather than average Marylanders, are really behind Cardin on this Israel Anti-Boycott Act. There's no popular support for it, but the lobby's demanding it. They'll be massing on Capitol Hill, demanding that this pass. It can fine Americans up to $1 million and put them in jail for 20 years for violating it. It's a complex law, and Americans are against it. When advised of the penalties and the fact that even the ACLU is fighting against it, 69% of Americans are against it. So if it does pass, the impact will be hugely consequential. Americans collectively will be pledged to defend Israeli exports from the illegal settlements, and their First Amendment activities will be severely curtailed. And finally, agenda item number 6, provoking U.S. confrontations with Iran. It's clear now that AIPAC and other nodes of the lobby would like to see the U.S. in a major confrontation with Iran. The advocacy organizations that worked against the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the AIPAC, ADL, AJC are now the champion of confrontation with Iran, and they have a candidate in the White House who signed a December 12 secret MOU to take military and intelligence actions against Iran. And there's a lot of assumption at the base of this secret agreement, if you believe the reports, that de facto they claim that Iran has an active nuclear weapons program. So agitating for war, though, is not an easy sell or popular. And AIPAC's operatives have worked behind the scenes and publicly to foment this confrontation. It's important to forget that Steve Weissman and Keith Weissman and Steve Rosen of the AIPAC espionage scandal of 2005 were essentially shopping around stolen intelligence to try to get the U.S. to attack Iran. That was the whole point of the exercise that led to their indictments. And so they're still hard at work. If you look at some public statements by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Patrick Clausen, he said that, gee, it's really hard to initiate a crisis, but perhaps we can get some sort of naval provocation in the Persian Gulf against an Iranian submarine to provide crisis initiation. So this is what's going on. And then finally, the Israel lobby's biggest and most important ask on Capitol Hill will be for massive unconditional foreign aid and state funding. It's interesting this year that USAID Administrator Mark Green will be speaking at AIPAC, and there's probably a reason for that. There's a potential new pool of assets. This would be all of the UN countries that voted against the United States and condemned the Jerusalem Declaration. Maybe the $38 billion that they get in US aid is now on the table. In fact, it may well be. 128 UN member states voted against the US, and maybe that's the pot of money that they'll be going after. There is a clear demand now that the $38.8 billion that the US promised in the last MOU is not enough. When Americans are informed of the amount of aid that's given to Israel, 58% say it's either too much or much too much. Particularly if they're informed that it's been $250 billion since 1948, which is far more than the US spent even to rebuild post-World War II Europe under the Marshall Plan. And this silent majority is certainly going to be not going to be heard next week. At AIPAC, politicians' names will be called, and they will be asked to rise in support of increasing aid, and they know that if they do not rise and enthusiastically support this, they'll be seeing a primary challenger and others coming after them quite soon. So 58% of Americans are against it, and this is consistent. When you ask the question in a number of different ways, Americans are consistently of the belief that we simply give too much foreign aid to Israel. So, what can we do about it? I'm going to be giving a few ideas in our closing remarks about what I think we can do about it. But first, I think we've got a sufficient introduction here that I would like to call up our first panel, the United Nations panel, to discuss the UN and these policies. Thank you very much. transitions.
These are empty.
Hello, I'm Janet McMahon, Managing Editor of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. I'm Janet McMahon, Managing Editor of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. And since April 5th, 1982, when we published our first issue, we have been covering all the activities of AIPAC and the Greater Israel Lobby. So it's great to see such a wonderful turnout for our 5th conference on the Israel Lobby. And as you all know, there's a very strong wind outside today. And thank you for braving that wind. And it's a wind that I do think is blowing in our direction. So as a result of last century's 2 world wars, the majority of the world's countries committed themselves to the principle of international law, which was embodied in the United Nations. But adherence to that principle and to the institution has not been guaranteed, and in some cases has been outright undermined. Our first speaker, Dr. Virginia Tilley, is a professor of political science at Southern Illinois University. She earned her MA and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and an MA from Georgetown's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. She has conducted research in Central America, Israel, Palestine, post-apartheid South Africa, and Oceania. She is the author of The One-State Solution, a pragmatic analysis of the two-state solution in Israel-Palestine, and editor of Beyond Occupation, Apartheid, Colonialism, and International Law in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. Dr. Tilley is also the co-author with Professor Richard Falk of a 2017 report commissioned by the UN's Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia titled Israeli Practices Towards the Palestinian People and the Question of Apartheid. Despite intense pressure from Israel and the US, the Commission's chair, Rima Khalif, refused to withdraw the report and resigned in protest. The UN subsequently deleted the report from its website. Fortunately, however, we are about to benefit from the expertise which informed that report's findings. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Virginia Tilley.
Thank you very much. It's a distinct privilege to be here, especially in the somewhat daunting position of first speaker. I just have to set the tone. I'm not seeing my presentation quite yet. Maybe that could go on. There we go. In this presentation, I'm not actually going to talk too much about the findings of the report. We really did write that report for a broad, informed audience of concerned people, and it is not hard to read. I think you don't have to be a legal scholar to do it. So I'm going to briefly summarize the report itself and then talk about what I think is much more engaging at this point to me, which is the implications of the report, implications for diplomacy and conflict resolution in Israel-Palestine. So I was asked first to address the question of, is the U.S. supporting an apartheid state in Israel-Palestine? Well, yes, it is, in short. It is an apartheid state. And by the way, there is no such thing in international law as apartheid state, but its practices are consistent with apartheid, and I'll come to that in a moment. But the deeper answer here is yes, and so are a lot of other people, including people who wouldn't think they are. And that's what I wanted to come to in regard to the implications of this finding for questions such as the two-state solution. Essentially, those seeking partition are endorsing an apartheid state, and that is a bit startling, so I want to get to that. And it raises this dilemma that if apartheid anywhere is inadmissible, and destabilizing, it cannot comprise the basis for a just and stable peace. Now, this lifts us out of a question of whether you're pro anybody, and simply if you're concerned about international peace and security, which apartheid is considered to be a threat to. So in this talk, again, I'm going to talk briefly about the analysis, the legal definition of apartheid, how it works, and why it requires Israel to sustain the occupation. This is a particular point I'd like to bring forward here, and then move on to the implications, and why it brings us directly to the question of reunification as the only viable mode of conflict resolution. So it is based on three sources. The first is my own book that I wrote narrowly on the question of whether Israel could be expected to withdraw from the occupied territories to allow a two-state solution. The second one was this really extraordinary experience of coordinating a team of international lawyers. I'm a political scientist, not an international lawyer, through a project supported by the South African government. I believe this is on the desk out there. It is a legal analysis. Any of you who are familiar with international law should find it rewarding. Others of you might find it a bit dense. And the third one, of course, is this wonderful experience I had, a privilege of working with Dr. Richard Falk on the UN report, which was mentioned already. And a lot of what I'm going to say here came out of that report, but a lot of what's in that report relied on the previous one, Beyond Occupation. So the deeper legal analysis for the UN report is to be found there. So what is apartheid? We, very briefly, the report gets into this in detail. We use apartheid very broadly. Anything that sort of strikes us as racist or segregationist maybe elicit this term. That's perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. We use terms anyway that are suggestive or useful for a particular analysis. But if we're going to argue that states are accountable under international law to act to end apartheid, then we must refer to the law which prescribes that obligation. That means we are brought to the relevant international law, and that is found in two major instruments: the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The first definition is far larger, much more detailed, but it lists a series of acts, including segregation and reserves that I'll come to. But it says that these are only acts of apartheid under certain conditions. They have to fit certain overarching conditions. And those conditions include, they may be similar to practices in South Africa. This is a universal instrument. They do not have to be exactly the same. The point is whether they they have these other qualities of the law, that they are, that these are acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination. I call that the purpose clause. And that it involves racial groups, and a systematic system of oppression, that it is not just a random collection of discrete laws, but a comprehensive institutionalized system that distinguishes the apartheid. And the Rome Statute picks up on that by bringing in a new term, which is institutionalized regime. Political scientists get all flushed with pleasure when you talk about regimes because we have loads of theory about regimes. We start to feel a little bit more on familiar land. All these elements of the definition are satisfied in this case. The report, I refer you to the report on this. It is an institutionalized regime. It's a comprehensive system of laws that ensures Jewish national privileges. And I want to stress that hyphenated construction here. The idea that Jews are a nation and that as a people or a nation that they have this certain privileges. That it does include policies similar to South Africa, but any policy variation there would not disqualify them necessarily, but it's nonetheless quite suggestive that they do. It is a racial conflict according to international law, defining what is racial discrimination, which includes groups defined by descent. And in this case, the local construction of Jewishness and Palestinianness or Arabness is dissent groups. The key quality here, which conveys special privileges to one group over another, is postulations about their descent and therefore their rights to the land dating from antiquity. Expressed particularly in the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel, which has the status of constitutional law in Israeli law. I'm speaking kind of fast here about law, so if you're getting a little like the wind outside, it's not to worry. It's clarified in the report. And crucially, the purpose clause is satisfied, that there is this aim, this formal aim, to maintain Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. We have a cluster of laws and policies on the books to look at to confirm that Israel has that purpose, if anyone was in doubt about it. So from a legal perspective, that is satisfied as well. What was more interesting to me when figuring out how Israel was pursuing its apartheid regime was the way it works, which is these crucial policy variations among four interwoven regimes, and by the domains, which domain referring here to a territorial, geographic entity, and a cluster of expectations, norms, rules, practices within that geographically defined ambit. The first domain being Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now, what matters here most is the right to vote, because if you're going to have Jewish and democratic state, then it becomes important not to allow non-Jews to vote those laws out. That means that you have to constrain the vote. You can allow people to vote, but you can't allow them to vote on that point. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that the non-Jewish vote is never large enough to threaten those laws. So Palestinian citizens of Israel famously do have the vote, which is often cited as the crucial difference with South Africa, but they are not allowed to vote against their own minority status. They are not allowed to vote against the Jewish national character of Israel. Palestinian residents of Jerusalem, about 300,000 people, have no national vote. They can vote for the municipal government, but not for the national government, so they are carefully excised from that potential body of voters who could challenge the Jewish national character of Israel. Palestinians in the occupied territories, of course, have no vote. They are not citizens. And they can vote for the Palestinian Authority under the terms of Oslo, but they are carefully sequestered. 5+ million people are carefully pushed out of any possibility of joining an electoral bloc that could challenge this state. And Domain 4 is the Palestinian refugees outside of the country, which outside of the territory under Israeli control, which is clearly, obviously, they don't have the vote. So another way to think of this is as a system. One regime that is effectively composed of four tailored sets of laws covering each population to achieve the same goal, which is to ensure that Israel remains a Jewish and democratic state. All kinds of arguments about whether you can be a Jewish and democratic state or a white and democratic state. I recognize that, but we don't have time to get into that now. What I would like to stress here is that this system requires that Israel maintain the occupation. Because if Israel does not keep the occupied territories under belligerent occupation, under military occupation, it faces the twin threat that a truly sovereign Palestinian state could form in those territories, which would then threaten Israel's capacity to prevent population mixing. Population mixing is the death knell for any racial state because the neat division of populations begins to go away. When you have people mixing, they make babies and it all falls down. On the other hand, annexation or full integration would require providing citizenship to the Palestinians, so that cannot be allowed either. Current talk about annexation is reflecting that dilemma, but it's better for Israel not to annex it. So what is the solution? Well, military occupation. So people who say, well, we have to solve, we must put apartheid to one side in order to look at the occupation. I think you have that the other way around. One is the logic of occupation is following the logic of apartheid. So speeding right along, part two, implications for diplomacy. If apartheid, as it always does, it destabilizes the whole region, threatens international peace and security, it must be stopped on those grounds alone. It is morally untenable. It's a crime against humanity. It must be stopped, but how? The vision of two states is fatally flawed. My first book on the one-state solution got into this in some detail, just from a pragmatic point of view. I really only addressed that one thing. But it does mean that we cannot anticipate that Israel will withdraw. It's become emperor's new clothes kind of fantasy to think that that will happen. I don't think that's acceptable anymore. It requires a great deal of defense, and it fails. Sustaining Jewish statehood on the part of the territory. This is the crucial thing. If you partition the land in order to allow Israel to remain Israel in one part of it and a Palestinian state to form in the other part of it, you are basically saying apartheid will continue in that part where Israel is now composed. Saying Israel will continue to be a Jewish and democratic state, it will continue to operate the way it is operating, it will continue to be an apartheid regime in a slightly different, modified border, within different borders. Now, my thought experiment, transplant that I did in South Africa, it would have been okay for white South Africans to sustain apartheid in part of the country and turn over the rest of it to black South Africans. No one entertained such an idea. It was anathema. This is the same thing here. You can't end apartheid by dividing the land and allowing it to continue in another part of the land. There's other aspects of this, but cutting to the chase, I would propose, therefore, that reunification is the only way to end apartheid. And since there's so many reasons to do that, we have to take that very seriously. For activism, and by activism I mean every kind of activism, from grassroots to legal activism and diplomatic activity and so forth. If you're going to and I just wanted to focus again on this angle of end the occupation. End the occupation is a mantra. It's a slogan. It's a sign people carry in marches. It's also a legal argument. But how? Again, Israel's withdrawal from the OPT cannot be anticipated. At best, it would be very partial. This is the Olmert plan, by the way, that you're looking at up here, where all the yellow would be Israel and the white would be Palestine, with a little umbilicus between the West Bank and Gaza. I mean, this is obviously an unviable state building. You couldn't control water, you couldn't control agriculture, you can't build a road that connects them, you can't, it's unworkable. Would not end apartheid. Establish a state of Palestine to leverage withdrawal. Now, this is a very popular movement right now, big diplomatic push in the United Nations to do this. However, my point here is that if we accept the apartheid analysis that this is an apartheid regime, then such a state would be a Bantustan. It would lack the attributions of true sovereignty. Israel, as long as it is composed as an apartheid regime, cannot accept any Palestinian state that is not a Bantustan, because any truly sovereign state would threaten the Jewish national character of Israel. This means that a Bantustan state, a state of Palestine formed under these conditions, would only secure Palestinian poverty, underdevelopment, frustration, insecurity, and essentially sustain the conflict itself. I'd like to just take an extra moment here, and I'm going to destroy my time constraint, I hope not, but I will pray, that a little bit of extra attention to the Bantustans is worthwhile, and I frankly encourage everyone here to Google that and spend 15 minutes looking at the Bantustans a bit more than we sometimes do. I went to South Africa to study this material because I realized I didn't understand it, and I found it fascinating as a comparison to the Palestinian Authority and the territorial and institutional constraints that it's operating under. Let's just think through the logic. Apartheid imperative. The imperative of apartheid, wherever it would appear, would be to prevent racial mixing. Okay. Otherwise, the whole logic begins to fall apart. If you can't discretely have different populations, there's nothing to defend. In order to do that, you need strict geographic segregation. This requires that if you're going to actually make this work, you need separate authorities within these territories. The South Africans, interestingly, called them black self-government authorities. And guess what Oslo called them? Palestinian Self-Government Authority. It's a great deal of conversations between Israel and South Africa about the Bantustans. I took a lot of lessons from it. I learned that from the diplomats in South Africa, by the way. This channels Palestinian or black or indigenous political aspirations to the local authority rather than to the state, to the dominant state. It's very convenient for an apartheid state to displace the frustrations and ambitions and the quest for rights of the population is dominating to their own leadership operating under very tight constraints, of course. The pictures you're looking at on the top is a lineup of the Bantustan leaders in South Africa in the there were 10 Bantustans, but 9 of these leaders were in this picture. And below the Palestinian Authority. And by the way, I don't mean to impugn the integrity or political will of any of the Palestinian Authority people. My point here is a structural one, that they are put into a position where they are compelled to act like a Bantustan authority. From the point of view of the dominant state, the main function of this authority is to repress dissent, which in the top picture you see the Bantustan armed forces, in the lower part you see the Palestinian armed forces doing exactly that, maintaining the Bantustan through proxy measures. I think the battery's giving out on this thing because I'm pushing and, oh. Let's see what happens now. Bing, there we go. All right. The Oslo Accords, we don't have time to get into this. I wrote a separate article about this, though, because I found it fascinating. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority on terms almost identical to the South African Bantustan constitutions, blow by blow. If you put those next to each other, you find almost exactly the same arrangements. And it's interesting that the ANC perceived this as a trap, rejected it from the beginning, and refused to have anything to do with it. And in fact, I understand Nelson Mandela told Arafat, bad idea, don't go for this is not a good idea, and they went for it anyway. That wasn't supposed to happen. A little tricky device here. So in short, the PIA is now locked into being this self-government authority, and it cannot act independently of that role. The alternative, therefore, is if the partition can only sustain apartheid, and we must rethink the conflict on using South Africa not as a model, but as inspiration or a kind of a thought experiment. They called it colonialism of a special type. It doesn't involve agreeing and admitting that a large population of people has come in and indigenized, is settled, is not going to go away. Call it settler colonialism. Shift the model from a colonial to a settler colonial model. And that means that you do not end it by partition or you can't end settler colonialism and its power by partition. You have to end it by eliminating settler domination. Treating Palestine as a multinational state is, on the basis of race, would only perpetuate a settler discourse, because it is Zionism that has proposed that there are these identities that that are then, if you recognize them and institutionalize them, you're essentially perpetuating apartheid. Treat the whole country as one country, Palestine, wrongly divided by race. This was the South Africa formula. It's one country wrongly divided by race. This means reunifying mandate Palestine. I'm out of time, aren't I? How am I doing? Okay. There is a legal basis for doing this. If we turn back to the League of Nations mandate, it always proposed that it was one country for everyone who lived there, that it would not be a Jewish state or anybody's state. It would be a secular democratic state. So there's a nice, fat legal argument to explore there. The hard part of this is that reunification does raise very serious questions of identity shifts, to reconstruct the idea of the nation, reconstruct the idea of the groups. In this case, Palestine would stop being a foggy mandate reference or a dreamy future, but it would be one state that belongs to all who live in it. It would not be the exclusive geographic heritage of any one part of the population. It would not require the departure or exclusion of anybody, which is tough for people who have lost a great deal to it. Jewish has to be reconceived as an ethnic group with full civil, social, and cultural rights, not a people with superior rights to the land, not as a nation with rights to self-determination. And Palestinian, this is the toughest thing for me to say as a non-Palestinian, but returning to the idea that it is a multi-sectarian identity, it still is actually, embracing everyone in mandate territory, not Arab in any sense that would exclude non-Arabs. Okay, this is one of the problems that Palestinian became a Palestinian Arab state. And under conditions of settler colonialism, you can't do that without excluding non-Arabs, and therefore, unfortunately, that has to be rethought deeply. Not the racial ethnic construction affirmed by Zionism and imposed by apartheid. So that's why the apartheid finding recasts everything. That's why so many people don't want to tackle it. I think it is crucial. I think it illuminates where we are and what is going on, and the more I look at it, the more powerful an analysis I think it is. And I do hope you will consider it seriously as a model for rethinking the conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tilley. Our next speaker, Ian Williams, is a native of Liverpool, England, and has been the Washington Report's UN correspondent since 1991. So it's no surprise that he really knows the ins and outs of that world body. He has twice served as president of the UN Correspondents Association and has won many awards for his exposés of UN malfeasance. At the same time, he has supported and defended the UN and its ideals, and has personally known 4 secretaries general, as well as numerous international diplomats and officials. Ian has been a columnist for The Nation and The Guardian American Online, and an editor for the World Policy Journal. A senior analyst for Foreign Policy in Focus, he is the author of The UN for Beginners and the recently published Untold, The Real Story of the United Nations in Peace and War. And he and Dr. Tilley will be signing their books during the break that follows this panel. Please join me in welcoming Ian Williams.
It'd be difficult to follow Virginia's detailed academic expose, but it's worth remembering, one of the big problems with the United Nations is people, what's it good for? And I'm very diffident about this. I tell people it's the worst possible organization except all the alternatives. And it does work that way. If you start off with a sense of realism about what the United Nations can do, what it stands for, then you don't get disappointed too easily, and you welcome its small successes. And there are successes, and they're very relevant here. And there's a very good reason why Israel and its lobby concentrate so much on the United Nations. What Kofi Annan called the unique legitimizing power of the United Nations. We've seen several results of this recently. And Israel can never get clear title of Jerusalem or the occupied territories without a UN say-so. That's key. And it's actually been proven since 1945. If you think of the occupations, East Timor, everyone had given up on East Timor. The Indonesians, I actually told the foreign minister over lunch one day, you'll never get clear title, ever, until you can get the UN to do it, and the UN won't. So they fought it to a standstill in there, but in the end, East Timor is independent. Only this week, and I don't know whether you saw this, the European Court of Justice actually ruled that the European Union had no right to sign fishing treaties with Morocco that included Western Saharan fisheries. In effect, the European Court was legitimizing boycotts of produce from occupied territories. I think that one is something that should be played up a lot more. Because I know it's a contentious subject, but we've pointed out several times in Washington Report that there's a separation wall in Western Sahara as well as in Palestine, that there are many parallels there. The other one, of course, is Western Sahara will, in fact, sometime, even you never see a map where it's included in Morocco. The Moroccans cannot get clear title. And it's the same with the occupied territories and Jerusalem. And this brings us back to the ambivalence of Israel and the lobby. They have, I should put this, it's almost psychological, psychoanalysis. They have a deep respect for law, but in a sort of the Talmudic way that makes the elevator stop on every floor in the Sabbath so they can still take the elevator and obey the letter. Israel spends a lot of time trying to work its way around the laws. It very rarely completely denies them. So at the United Nations, they and the US spend a lot of time trying to create the sort of Sabbath elevator so that they can skirt within the law. But they are very scared of actual definitions of the law. That's why they are so upset. If the UN were ineffectual, they wouldn't devote so much effort to thwarting resolutions in there. And take Virginia's subject, there is an apartheid convention. And it's like the Genocide Convention. There is a legal, international, binding commitment on member states to do something about an apartheid state. If Israel is declared to be an apartheid state, or practicing apartheid, there are legal consequences that states have to follow. In another regard, if you remember, Jim Baker in Bosnia and the State Department were very, very solicitous to make sure the word genocide never appeared. Mass murder was fine. Mass murder is something that you can ignore. Genocide has a binding legal commitment under the Genocide Convention. You have to do something about it. So, it looks like we're playing with words, but this is very, very serious. And the Israelis know that. For a start, they deny it, but in effect, Israel is the only state that was actually created by a UN resolution. So you have the conundrum that they have been busily denying the efficacy of the United Nations, its legitimacy, saying that the resolutions don't apply. But their very existence depends on a resolution. You hear continually a theme that General Assembly resolutions aren't binding. And we could say, amen, because it was a General Assembly resolution that partitioned Palestine and set up the Israeli state. So you can see you could have a whole joint conclave of Jesuits and Talmud scholars to work your way out of this particular fine print, where you're denying the basis for your own existence. And it does have international complications because the United States was a founding member of the United Nations. It's still an indispensable part of the United Nations. It's inconceivable that the United Nations would exist without the United States taking part in it. And this creates severe problems because there's always the Israeli exception. Almost every law that comes, every resolution that comes up is being weighed in the balance. Nuclear non-proliferation, we saw with Grant's presentation earlier. The United States is signatory to non-proliferation treaties that say that no country, apart from the five, what is now the five permanent members, should have nuclear weapons. And then it condones nuclear weapons in Israel. And because it does that, every other country in the world, India, Pakistan, North Korea, say, hey, if them, why not us? You're continually creating exceptions to your own rules that other people walk in through. You know, the settlements in particular, the US has never actually approved them, but they've changed the language so often over the years that as far as the US is concerned, Jerusalem is international territory. The State Department, I believe, just showing this punctiliousness about law, I think I read earlier this year that the State Department is still refusing to issue passports with Jerusalem, Israel, to Americans born there. It's still Jerusalem. They won't put Israel on there. So the State Department does have some residual respect for international law that's missing from the White House completely. So let's get these territories together, because the UN is like... the UN is a sort of cockpit for all of these things. All human life is there. You're watching it. And you have this ambivalent attitude, is most American Jews, as we know, are liberal, globalists. They support democracy and freedom. They like the United Nations. They made an exception because of all this stuff about Israel and Zionism as racism. They didn't think it through, but you know, it eroded the support. And this helped erode the support for the United Nations inside the US. You got the people who would automatically have been natural supporters of the UN were always ambivalent about it. You have Jewish senators from New York looking over their shoulders who will pass resolutions condemning the UN, cutting the funds. And that's one of the points that the lobby has been doing in Washington, is to try to trim the UN to size by threatening to withhold funds, or actually withholding funds, or pulling out of organizations, as we've seen recently. And the effect of this isn't just financial. It is a continual sort of attrition of the morale and standing in the UN. We've seen Secretary Generals now who realize that to get on with the US, you have to pander to the Israel lobby. And all Secretary Generals have done this to some extent, in a pragmatic political way. Kofi Annan was possibly the most accommodating up till then. Ban Ki-moon had a continual stream of the Jewish lobby organizations, B'nai B'rith, Conference of Presidents. They were coming into his office all of the time. He always received them. They were banging on the door. They were also in the UN, and they were banging on the doors of embassies. All of these funny swing states that you sort of, the microstates that only stamp collectors know about usually, will come up to support the US and Israel on these crucial resolutions. You know, the 2, 3, 6, the Pacific Trust Territories, a few others, they come there. And this is a result of intensive lobbying by the Israel lobby here on these states to affect Israeli policy. At the moment, we have a particular situation coming, which is it would be almost laughable, except it's so serious. I don't know whether you know, but Israel is actually running for a seat on the Security Council this year. And, you know, on the face of it, this is laughable, but we have to remember that Morocco was on the Security Council while occupying Western Sahara. Indonesia was on the Security Council while it was occupying East Timor. Rwanda was on the Security Council while it was massacring its own population. You know, so it's not totally unprecedented. But usually, they didn't actually say they're defying the whole gamut of international law openly. And is this likely to happen? I don't know. I don't want to get too much into it, but they're running for seat in the West European and Other group, which is an imperial sort of hangover, because essentially it is Europe plus the white Commonwealth, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, plus the US as a sort of ancillary member. And the Asians wouldn't have them. The Africans wouldn't have them. So in the end, intense lobbying by the lobby through the US came in and badgered the Europeans into accepting Israel as a sort of associate member so it could run for offices, which run on a rotatory basis. So Israel became a vice president of the General Assembly, became chairman of obscure committees. Would you believe the Israeli ambassador, I think, is chairman of the legal subcommittee at the moment, which is, well, it's like putting Casanova in charge of the chastity committee. Does not compute. But this Israeli ambassador is actually very, very concerned about this bid. Then this was upgraded very quietly so that Israel became a full member. So it was allowed to run for this, it could run for the Security Council. And the mechanics of this is, regrettably, I mean, it's good for Western Europe, but most of the countries, the Security Council seats rotate on a Buggins turn basis. You know, they have calendars going decades ahead sometimes of who occupies what position at the UN, which is why you get genocides in the Human Rights Committee, and now you might get Israel on the Security Council. And the reason for that is West Europe is the only one that actually has elections. And if they don't decide within their own group, then it goes to a general poll of all the members to who becomes a temporary member of the Security Council. So Germany and Belgium are the current candidates, and Israel is running against them. And I've been trying to sort of calculate the odds on this. It's difficult. You know, I can imagine there are the Israeli diplomats going into Berlin and saying, "You owe us so much. Why don't you do the right thing? Why don't you stand down and let us run? How could you deny us? Do you want to compound your crimes?" And the Germans will say, "Well, we'll give you another submarine. Shut up. We're taking this one," I suspect. But I am worried about Belgium. You know, the other people will gang up on Belgium and say, "You should stand down and do the right thing." Because that's the only way to get in. If it goes to an open poll, Israel isn't going to get it. But if it's done with a stitch-up like this, if Belgium is leaned upon sufficiently by the other powers, it might just do it. So it's worth watching, and it's worth intervening. What's the practical effect? A lot. You know, discussions in the Security Council, they do end up crucial, the resolutions that come through. Even a temporary member in there can have considerable effect. You know, while France was grandstanding over the Iraq war, it was the other smaller countries with a respect for international law, like Jamaica and Ireland and others like that, who actually provided the bulk of the opposition to the Iraq war in there and stood their ground. Where do we get to with this ambassador? And I think this is where it brings the lobby in as well. Because the UN is so unpopular in some parts of America, like the evangelical Christians, or with the die-hard Zionists, it's a great fundraising gamut. I keep getting letters from various organizations saying, "Poor little Israel, the only country not allowed to be on the Security Council. Poor little Israel, continually victimized at the United Nations. Send a check." And I think it's one of the dynamics, I think Grant touched on it before, is these organizations are businesses. They're self-sustaining businesses, so they want checks off people. And if they can find an issue at the United Nations, they can raise money on the strength of it, and they do. But then it has a practical effect, because Secretary Generals, UN staff get pilloried, they get harassed to do the right thing. And we've seen that with the reports that have been squashed. You know, they'll just get dropped, or they'll be sidelined. I mean, look what happened to poor Arthur Goldstone. No, he was personally harried into the ground until he gave up. You know, I felt he was almost a tragic figure by the end, because he started off with such integrity. But with the US, it's even worse, because it destroys the whole basis of the United Nations. The embassy move is in direct defiance of the UN Charter. The US, the founder and drafter of the UN Charter. When the UN Charter was flown from San Francisco to Washington, the case had its own parachute. Alger Hiss, who was carrying the case, didn't have a parachute. I think maybe they knew something or suspected something. But, I mean, that was how seriously the US took the UN at the time. And this is setting at naught international law. I mean, it's been defied, but this is the significance of it. Donald Trump has basically ripped up the UN Charter. And then because we're talking about people who can believe 3 impossible things before breakfast, like the Red Queen in Alice, they are now saying, but Iran is in defiance of UN resolutions. Therefore, we must take action against it. Because that's the other fulcrum at the moment. The case for a war against Iran is being made in the United Nations. Our current ambassador, Nikki Haley, there is, I mean, she should get her credentials from Tel Aviv. Not Jerusalem. Because I've never heard her say anything that isn't 150% in support of Israel. She really is. I mean, she's devoted her full time there, and she gets there and pledges in. It gets down to the actual reason why the lobby is so important for these people. You want power in Washington, it goes through the lobby. You want to be president in the United States, as the US ambassador to the UN most assuredly does, you go through the lobby. They will jump through any hoops at all to do it. And that risks they risk the organization, which for all its faults, it's a major but pragmatic conclusion. You may look at the UN and say it's a failure, but as people in there will tell you, we haven't had World War III yet. And that's the measure. But this is the road to World War III. If you dissolve the whole structure of international global law and security, that's where we're going. And that's what Donald Trump has started, and he's done it on behalf of the lobby in there. He's done it because all across this country, people are writing checks to congressmen, persuading them to vote in defiance of international law and to vote to revile the United Nations. There are refugees who will be going very, very hungry all across the Middle East soon because Donald Trump has defunded UNRWA, which, by the way, has been doing the Israelis a favor. They've been very ambivalent. They like to revile it to keep it off balance. But you have to remember that UNRWA has been doing what Israel should have been doing as the occupying power. UNRWA has been paying for the health and education of occupied Palestinians when the occupying power should have been doing it under the Geneva Convention. So the Israelis have known this all along, and they've reviled and shouted about UNRWA, but only so far. I think they are privately probably appalled that Trump has actually followed through on their bluff and cut the funding. No, we didn't mean it, Mr. President. We want the money, honestly. We just want to keep them under control. So they have kept them under control to a large extent. They've kept Secretary General after Secretary General under control to some extent. But it still comes back to it. Ban Ki-moon had all of these people from all of the Israeli organizations coming in. But he always, once he'd been to Gaza and saw what was happening in Gaza, that was the key. The Israelis tried to stop him going to Gaza. As soon as he got there, you see all of his statements, he stated very clearly the UN positions about occupation, about Gaza. And so, yes, he kept receiving them, but then he would tell them, you've got to break the siege. You cannot keep on doing this. You've got to end the occupation. And Guterres is in the same position. He's instinctively pro-Israeli, like a lot of European social democrats. But he is now telling them, gently, you've got to. But the terrible thing is, as long as the US is 100% behind Israel, and as long as the lobby keeps it that way, then the UN is never going to be a functioning international body in a complete way, which is bad news for the world, all of us, on every level. You know, whether it's climate change or whatever. It is an indispensable organization, and I see I've entered the red light district now. So I'd better wind up. I always stay in the red light district if I can, but I'll go and sit down. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian. Our final speaker, Noura Erakat, is a noted legal scholar, human rights attorney, and activist. She is an assistant professor at George Mason University, a co-founder and editor of Jadaliyya e-Zine, and an editorial committee member of the Journal of Palestine Studies. Prior to joining the George Mason faculty, she served as legal counsel for a House subcommittee, legal advocate for the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, and as the national grassroots organizer and legal advocate at the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, now the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Most recently, she released a pedagogical project on the Gaza Strip and Palestine, the centerpiece of which is a short multimedia documentary titled Gaza in Context, which positions Israel's wars on Gaza within a settler colonial framework. She is also the producer of the short video Black Palestinian Solidarity and is currently working on a book project tentatively titled Justice for Some, Law as Politics in the Question of Palestine. It's a great pleasure to introduce Nora Erekat.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you to all of you. I think you are very brave to come to this session, which focuses on law, which in and of itself is meant to be obscurist in order to disempower people to take their lives into their own hands, and by its very definition is indeterminate. So what we believe the law to proclaim is going to be subject to our own mediation as well as judicial interpretation. So anything on its face that the law tells us can be subject to some sort of legal controversy depending on who the lawyer is representing. So I really appreciated Dr. Tilley's presentation, but if my client were Israel, I could use the very same legal framework to come to a very different conclusion, which is why our reliance on law has to come with a great deal of skepticism and with a strategic vision. With that in mind, I want to build on what was said earlier to discuss occupation law and the way that occupation law has not failed to stem the proliferation of settlements and settlers within the West Bank and in Gaza until 2005, but instead, without occupation law, Israel could not have and could not continue to expand and entrench its settler colonial presence within the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, and frankly, throughout Mandate Palestine. So quick note on framework. Dr. Tilley walked us through apartheid and said that this would recast how we envision this to now think of it as settler colonialism. I want to urge us to think of this as settler colonialism first, project that's distinct from colonization in that the settler who travels into the colony is traveling with their sovereignty with an intent to stay. That intent to stay in the colony and to assert their sovereignty also places an imperative to remove the native. And so that there are two processes at play. There is the removal of the native with the intent to replace them with the settler and to establish a continuous, uninterrupted, temporal, and spatial presence. And this is from Patrick Wolf's Logic of Elimination, so that the Nakba and the removal of the settler, of the Palestinians, isn't an event, but becomes an ongoing Nakba, as Palestinians have referred to it, but also fits in this theoretical framework. If then we begin with settler colonization as the framework, apartheid and occupation become two legal regulatory regimes that enable and fulfill those settler colonial ambitions of removal and replacement. So Dr. Tilley discussed one approach, I'll discuss apartheid, I'll discuss occupation. I'm not sure how this works, but here's the map that you may be familiar with. Obviously, Israel never defined its borders. These are the 1949 armistice lines established in March that have never been declared in order to facilitate expansion. When Israel conquered the territories in 1967, 90% of Israelis polled wanted to maintain them, mostly for religious reasons, with having an affectionate relationship to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria. But that religious relationship had no political legitimacy, and therefore Israel had no basis to remain and was compelled to actually withdraw. But Israel wanted the territories, wanted to get around the law, and again, as what was mentioned, how do you get through that elevator? Wanted to get around the law. It couldn't annex the territories, even if it wanted to, because of the prohibition on annexation, which comes into disrepute in the late 18th century. Up until then, territorial conquest was permitted. But it also, let's say that it didn't care about the laws we've seen in its annexation of Jerusalem and otherwise. It didn't want to annex the territory because it would have to absorb the Palestinian population, thereby disrupting a Jewish demographic majority that had been established in the aftermath of the Nakba and the removal of 800,000 Palestinian natives. So how then? And if it recognized the territory as occupied, it would have to revert the territory to its sovereign and maintain the territorial, demographic, and political status quo. So here's the problem. It wants the land, but it doesn't want the people on the land. If it annexes the land, it absorbs the population. If it doesn't annex the land and acknowledges occupation, it has to give the land back. So instead, Israel creates a new category in law known and declares that this occupation is sui generis, or distinct and unlike any other category, and argues that because Jordan's annexation of the West Bank in 1950 is not recognized by anyone besides Britain and Pakistan, and Egypt is only in authority of the Gaza Strip, and Palestinians don't exist as a people, that the territories belong to no sovereign. As such, occupation law, as enshrined by the Hague Regulations, the Fourth Geneva Convention, as well as customary law, cannot be triggered. There is a sovereign void. This is not occupation by law, but shall be an occupation by fact. What does that allow Israel to do? It allows it the legal right to have presence in the territories without the legal obligation to maintain the status quo ante until the reversion of sovereignty. What does that allow for Israel? It allows it to incrementally take the land under two legal fictions, the legal fiction of military necessity and the legal fiction of temporality. As far as military necessity is concerned, the idea is that it is taking the land in order to create military encampments, and that all of the civilian presence is temporary. Obviously, that's a contradiction on its face, because you don't place civilians in a military encampment, otherwise you're using your own civilians as human shields, or it is in fact permanent. That is the first legal fiction. The second legal fiction of temporality is what Meir Shamgar, the military advocate general, and then Chief Justice for the Israeli High Court for 2 decades, describes as temporality. It's a temporary presence of the civilians, but it is not, which is indefinite, which is the opposite of permanent. Meaning that it is not permanent, but we do not have to declare an end to it, and that is the opposite of permanency, and therefore can be temporary. That is a legal fiction. But these legal fictions survive because the law in and of itself, and especially international law, lacking a hierarchical adjudication system, lacking a reliable enforcement model, becomes subject to the political will of the international community, and therefore can vary by application, implementation, and interpretation as it does here. The United States is central to this interpretation. And it's central to this interpretation despite the fact that it has its sub-administrations from the Johnson administration to the present, well, not this administration, have recognized that occupation law applies as a matter of law, not fact, and Israel is actually an occupying power, but has failed to implement its own interpretation of law for 2 reasons. One is, in the aftermath of the 1967 war, the Johnson administration determined the value of Israel as a Cold War asset in the Middle East as it vied with the Soviet Union to fill the power vacuum left by the European colonial powers. In that struggle to fill the power vacuum, what it decided and inaugurated after 1967 was a policy of ensuring Israel's qualitative military edge over any single one of its neighbors or collection of its neighbors so that it could prevail in a military confrontation should it arise. That's policy 1. Before that, the United States had maintained a stalemate policy of equally arming Israel and its allied Arab monarchical regimes. So qualitative military edge. The second policy that it inaugurates and this is another piece of this framework of why this sui generis occupation works, is that the Johnson administration also inaugurates and helps to orchestrate the Land for Peace framework, which is enshrined in UN Security Council Resolution 242. At the time that Israel occupies these territories, as well as the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the UN is in session and is in agreement that Israel is an occupying power and should withdraw. If, in fact, its attack on Egypt's Air Force, which had lain barren in the Sinai Peninsula and which was destroyed in 2 hours, if that initial attack was unprompted, then Israel has committed aggression, which is use of force that is illegal, and therefore has the legal obligation to withdraw without preconditions. If instead that was a preemptive use of force or self-defense, then Israel has the right to remain as an occupying power, but under no circumstances to assert title or territorial conquest. Why does this matter? In the drafting of the Security Council resolution, Johnson personally himself wanted to ensure that Israel can maintain the territories as consideration for exchange in exchange with the Arab states for permanent peace as part of a contractual agreement. Johnson was senator during Eisenhower's administration when Eisenhower forced Israel, France, and the UK to withdraw from the Suez Canal. And so and Johnson thought at the time, Israel should have been allowed to maintain the Egyptian territory and hold on to it until Egypt agreed to normalize its relationship with it and to establish a permanent peace. Here in 1967, the opportunity arose again, and rather than apply international law and withdrawal as a legal obligation, instead it becomes reformulated as a political equation of a quid pro quo exchange of land when you give us peace. In the negotiations, there was disagreement. Israel wanted to keep it. So there was disagreement about which territories were to be withdrawn from. And the debate then raged about the terms of withdrawal, of immediacy, what would come first, withdrawal or peace. There was one other piece of the debate, which was the armistice lines as being tenuous and not being the permanent lines. The Johnson administration, as well as the UK, urged that the definite article "the" be dropped from the resolution in order to permit negotiation on the permanent borders, but never, ever to actually change the territorial integrity. And so here is one. There were 5 draft resolutions at the time. This is the Latin American bloc resolution. You could see in every other draft resolution, besides the one that's ultimately presented by the United Kingdom that becomes the language of 242, the definite article "the," all the territories, is included. The US votes for this, by the way. It doesn't pass because there's disagreement about the sequence of withdrawal or peace. This is the final resolution. This is actually 242. You'll see that the definite article is dropped. But in the preambular text, there's the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by war. In the actual clause itself, it's stipulated that it was occupied in recent conflict. We know that legal loopholes are coming. And state after state, including France, argue that this is to be understood as allowing for minor border modifications. But Abba Eban, who represents Israel to the UN during this time and is quite exceptional in his skills, explains very forthrightly, the resolution means what it says and does not mean what it does not say. Another legalese that becomes consequential to this present day, together with Israel's own logic of what it would need to establish permanent borders, this one articulated by Deputy Prime Minister Yigal Allon, who argues that defensible borders would be tantamount to this. As you could see, all of the orange is what Israel defines as what its defensible borders would look like. and what would be necessary for security purposes. There is Jerusalem is part of that plan. There is continuity between the interior of Israel as well as its border with Jordan. It controls almost the entirety of the eastern border. This is what it wanted articulated in 1967. It has achieved far more than that. It has achieved far more than that into the present. So let me just also add here that this could not be possible to the present without Palestinian participation and acquiescence, as embodied and represented through the peace process that's inaugurated in 1993. The Oslo Accords themselves, Dr. Tilley referred that we should compare them to apartheid plans. I would urge you to compare them to the 1978 Middle East peace process framework established by Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin that articulates a framework of autonomy without sovereignty. And it is verbatim a replication of that document that never envisioned a state. A state was never part of the negotiations. And this outcome is not because the law didn't work, it's because the law has worked perfectly well and very effectively that we have this outcome. How does that work? So here are the three parts. Israel is claiming that it is a sui generis occupation, therefore it has no legal obligation to apply occupation law, including the prescription on civilian settlement and captured or encapsulated by Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, also tantamount to a war crime. And under their presence, they can both take the land under military necessity and remain there under the legal fiction of temporality. Then, why can they change the borders and not maintain the 1967 border? Because under Security Council 242, the resolution doesn't specify, it says withdraw from territories, but doesn't specify from which territories, because of the lack of the definite preposition. And three, this would have totally failed as a legal argument because it does not withstand any judicial scrutiny and has been rejected by the International Court of Justice, by the International Criminal Court, by the UN Security Council, as we've seen most recently in UN Security Council 2334, as well as by multiple human rights organizations, but nevertheless, remains valid as a legal argument because of the third prong, which is the US provision of political immunity and support, despite its own policy imperatives, because it doesn't want to apply sanctions on Israel because that would diminish its qualitative military edge, and it doesn't want to apply international law as a matter of that would dictate the outcome because that would actually diminish Israel's negotiating hand in negotiations. And so those three parts together, reinforcing, create this outcome today, where Israel has taken the land, but not taken the people, and has enabled it to remove the Palestinians, to concentrate them, and to dispossess them onto these plots of land. This scenario that we see in the West Bank very vividly also exists in the Gaza Strip, but even there it's a very large concentration, and it too has been reduced in size the last time in 2014 by expanding the buffer zone by 40%. And if I had the map, which I do not, of Israel proper, we can see the concentration of Palestinians similarly. I think it was the first zone that Dr. Tilley pointed out to you, both in the Galilee region, which is the highest concentration of Palestinian citizens of Israel or natives, essentially, as well as in the Negev. The concentration of Palestinians in the Negev is what is driving Israel today to remove those Palestinians forcefully, approximately 70,000 Palestinians, to place them into, concentrate them into urban townships, remove from their agricultural livelihoods, and to build an Israeli settlement within Israel in their place in order to disrupt their ability to return or have a claim of that return, fully fitting within a settler colonial framework, which is what we are marching towards. And in fact, by defunding UNRWA, what we're doing is diminishing the idea is to make them indistinct from the rest of the Arab population so that they can be absorbed elsewhere in surrounding countries, and therefore further diminish the demographic threat, so to speak, and further the idea of establishing Israel's Jewish settler sovereignty to be uncontested. That settler sovereignty to this day remains contested because of the demographic balance, and within Israel it remains an active frontier. There are other settler colonies in the world. Israel is not unique for this. The United States is a settler colony. What we see going on in the Dakota Access Pipeline is actually the removal of natives and taking away of their lands and obscuring the fact that they exist as a people and perpetuating a myth that the natives have disappeared in very similar ways that we perpetuate the myth of disappearance of Palestinians and their indistinct nationality with surrounding Arab countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all our panelists for their elucidation of a very complex topic. And I'm glad that Grant showed us his slide of Americans' response when they are told that moving the embassy to Jerusalem is a violation of international law. They oppose that move. So I think the more people understand international law and what it is and how we're violating it, that's what we can do to help educate people. So since we're the first panel, I think we should stop on time and let the other panels hang themselves by their own petard. And also I want to, Virginia Tilley and Ian Williams will be signing copies of their books out past the registration table. And Professor Tilley's book is going to be sold for $30, not $45. It's the only book of hers we got in time today. So we're taking a 20-minute break. Thank you very much, and we'll see you shortly. Hello. Hi, Penny Mitchell with the Palestinian American Research Center. I wanted to say hi to you when you were at Mesa. And I enjoyed